This is apropos. Well, Syrian rebels are tonight pushing closer to the major city of Hama as war monitors report the heaviest fighting yet, with government forces, insurgents capturing several villages today north of Hama, Syria's fourth largest city. An attack there would ramp up pressure on President Bashar al-Assad, whose Russian and Iranian allies have scrambled to support him since rebels captured Aleppo last week. Any sustained escalation in Syria risks further destabilising the wider region. With the latest, here's Solange Moujan.
Filming in and staking their ground in this palace is a prize in and of itself for these insurgent fighters. For it had been one of President Bashar al-Assad's residences. The symbolic seizing was part of a lightning-fast storming of Aleppo, which began November 27th. It was, for the coalition of groups, the biggest success against the Assad regime in years. Clashes between a constellation of insurgents and Assad's troops and his allies have now broken out across the war-torn nation, killing hundreds. It has also upped the ante among different foreign powers involved in Syria. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, Iran-backed Iraqi soldiers have been crossing into Syria to support al-Assad troops, and Russian jets have been bombing the insurgent positions in the northwest, like in Idlib. For civilians, full-on war is back in their lives, in a conflict that began in 2011 with al-Assad's crackdown on democracy protests, but which had been largely frozen since 2020.
We woke up to the sounds of terror, fear, and airstrikes. I can't describe the horror we witnessed and what we felt. We live in a camp that's next to a family that was hit.
The UN says they are alarmed by the escalation of the sudden violence, which has in less than a week displaced nearly 50,000 people. More than half of them are children.
Syrians have endured the conflict for nearly 14 years. They deserve a political horizon that will deliver a peaceful future, not more bloodshed.
With violent clashes continuing in places like Idlib, Hama and Deir al-Zor, but also elsewhere across Syria, the UN's Human Rights Office says that civilians are being killed in the crossfire, adding to an already dire humanitarian situation, where nearly 17 million people in Syria depend daily on humanitarian aid.
To discuss, we're joined now by Aaron Y. Zelen, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Good to have you on the programme with us this evening, Aaron. Syrian rebels, they're very close to Hama as we speak, just a few kilometres from the city. Just tell us what exactly they're looking for. They're vowing to push all the way into Damascus. How far do you think they'll be able to go?
I think it's one of the biggest questions we have right now. Many people, even those that have followed Syria going back to the uprising in 2011, are quite surprised at how quickly Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the main group that's led this offensive, took over Aleppo in 4 days, and now it's seemingly possible that they might take over Hama. One of the biggest questions going forward is how deep can they go into the core territories of the regime, whether it's on the Alawite coast or in sort of Fortress Assad in Damascus. So far, there's been not a ton of resistance. There's been more as they've gotten closer to Hama and Homs, which goes down to Damascus. But we'll see, depending on how Iran and its proxy network deals with these issues now.
And it seems like they have been facing, kind of firmer pressure over the past 24 hours or so as they get closer to Hama. How prepared do you think these rebels were for this offensive? Had they been waiting for a particular opportunity to strike?
Well, we've seen that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham built a military college actually about 3 years ago to try and integrate all the different insurgent groups that have been fighting under its command over the years to be more integrated and also more together when they do these types of operations. And we've seen sort of the professionalization of this in this campaign. I'm unsure that HTS or Jalani, the leader of the group, suspected that this would happen so quickly. I think that, they've always wanted to take over Aleppo. They've always wanted to take over Damascus. It's more the speed at which it's all happened and the fact that the regime kind of collapsed. And I think they took the opportunity after sort of the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah went down because they didn't want to be perceived as being anything related to Israel. And therefore, once that ceasefire happened, they started to storm Aleppo. And we've seen everything that's happened now in almost the past week.
Well, talk to us a little bit more about the jihadist group then, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. It says it broke ties with al-Qaeda back in 2016. Experts say that since then it's been trying to reinvent itself, so to speak. How does it differ from other militant groups? Who exactly is it?
So I think one of the key things to understand is that it essentially went from global jihad, when it was previously part of the Islamic State and al-Qaeda, to now it's a local regime. It acts more similar to a lot of other authoritarian governments in the region of the Middle East. They've disavowed anything related to any of those terrorist groups in the past. And what they've been doing since the ceasefire in 2020 is building up a lot of institutions in terms of a ton of ministries and offices and directorates to help people on a daily basis. They've primarily been focused on that alongside developing sort of the professionalization of their military capabilities to try and present themselves as more palatable alternatives, as well as being the key players now in sort of the opposition, even if the original protesters that, went against the regime back in 2011 were calling for a liberal democracy. Now we're seeing more of, conservative Islamist type of proto-state being developed.
And the speed at which they've been able to move through those areas of Syria, what does it say about the grip on power that Assad currently has?
I think it's important to recall that most of the fighting that took Aleppo back from the insurgency back in 2016 was done by Iranian proxy Shia militia as well as Russian Air Force. Of course, there were Syrian regime fighters involved, but they did the bulk of it. So, in many ways, we're just seeing a return to some of the lines that we saw 8 years ago, but even more dramatically because the regime has been weakened so much over the last decade plus. Plus, you have to recall that, Russia is a bit more distracted now as a consequence of going all in Ukraine. And then Iran and its so-called axis of resistance has been weakened a ton due to Israel's combating against them post-10/7 attack against Hamas as well as Hezbollah. And therefore, this has been the perfect opportunity from the perspective of a group like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to take advantage. How far they can go, I think, is, the million-dollar question. I think even people who follow this every single day when it was no longer the top news story are still kind of surprised at how quick everything's been going on.
Could this be then the start of another Middle Eastern war? What does it tell us about how volatile really the wider region is?
It illustrates that many of the grievances that animated people when the protests first started in 2011 remain, and that, the main issue to stability in Syria continues to be the Assad regime and him and his co-chair remaining in power. And until that changes, I think we'll continue to see spates of violence, whether it's larger scale violence like we've seen in the last week or so, or more, frozen conflict type of violence that we saw in the prior 4.5 years. We also haven't discussed how other groups in the country might take advantage of this. We've seen that the Islamic State has actually been at its most active in the last year, in the previous 3 years after building itself back up, also more in the eastern part of Syria. Of course, we haven't heard much from them in the last week, but there's no doubt that they'll try and take advantage of any deficiencies that the regime might have as well.
So they could end up, in effect, benefiting from what's happening now?
Well, one of the good things is that the United States and the global coalition against ISIS remain in eastern Syria alongside the Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces, so they've been continuing to fight them. The issue is less so in those zones, but more ISIS potentially taking advantage in the area where the Assad regime currently controls, because they are now probably a bit more distracted in dealing with what they perceive as a greater threat right now.
What impact then on what happens in Lebanon then?
For now, at least, we haven't seen any spillover. However, if you go back to 2012, 2013, 2014, you did see, a bunch of people becoming refugees going into Lebanon. You also saw al-Qaeda and the Islamic State trying to do terrorist attacks. And then you also saw Hezbollah coming into the conflict to assist the Assad regime. We saw a statement from some Hezbollah, operatives recently saying that they don't necessarily have the capacity to do anything right now. So for now, at least, I think that, Lebanon and Syria are two different zones in terms of what they're dealing with. Lebanon more vis-a-vis the, conflict with Israel over the past year, whereas Syria is more reanimation of the uprising that happened in 2011. But if things continue to, deteriorate, it's definitely plausible that the situation in Lebanon could change also.
And Russia, we've seen vowing to continue its support for the Assad regime. But what kind of resources does it have at this point, seeing the current situation in Ukraine?
It's definitely a bit more limited now due to Ukraine. It's also key to understand that Russia's had a lot of military activity in different parts of Africa as well over the last few years. So they can't necessarily rely upon the same assets. And there's also been the defanging of the Wagner group after Prigozhin tried to essentially do a coup d'etat in Russia last year. So there's definitely a bit more limitations on what they can do, but there's no doubt that they will continue to be involved in the airstrike campaign. And, mainly it's been targeting random parts of Syria where the opposition is, and has led to a lot of civilian deaths and casualties.
And do you think, Aaron, it's likely that Russia and Turkey could be further drawn into the conflict, into direct fighting, perhaps?
I'm not sure that either country wants to directly fight one another. However, there's obviously Turkey backing a different group than HTS called the Syrian National Army. They're more kind of in the north central part of Syria, not really at the active frontline zone of what we're seeing in Hama now. But it's plausible that they might try and take more territory from the Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces, which in turn could lead to more issues between the United States and Turkey because the U.S. has been backing the SDF. So as you can see, there's a lot of different countries and a lot of different factors and complexities within the broader Syrian conflict. Even if we just talk about Syria, there's a ton of different zones of influence by different countries as well as actors on the ground.
Aaron, thank you so much for taking us through all of that. That is Aaron Y. Zelen, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thank you so much. That is it from